Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on general business conditions. I'm Haley Chinander with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Before we get started digging into the results of this survey, I do have some housekeeping items. Slides for this presentation and a copy of the video link will be emailed to all registered attendees within the next week. Ron and I are going to be entertaining questions at the end of our presentation, so if you have a question, please type it in the chat box on Zoom. We'd love to get your feedback at the end of this presentation as well, so please take a moment to fill out the brief 3-question survey that pops up in your Zoom window when you exit the webinar. I also want to note that the views expressed during this presentation are the presenters and not those of the Minneapolis Fed or the Federal Reserve System. So now I'm going to provide a little background on this general business survey. The general business survey is one of the largest regular surveys of businesses conducted among the 12 regional reserve banks. We're able to hear from so many of these businesses thanks to our partnerships with chambers and government agencies and other business and community groups who send the survey to their contacts on our behalf. So as always, I just have to say a huge thank you to all of our partners who help make this possible. Now, the survey we're discussing today was conducted between July 14th and August 1st. We got 731 responses from business owners across the region, and about half were from Minnesota businesses. We also had really strong showing of support among businesses outside of the metro area this time around. We continue to see good balance by both firm size and sector. I just have to note, though, that these responses come from a convenient sample of businesses and may not be representative of the larger business population. And because of this, the results of the survey should be seen as more of a snapshot of current conditions and interpreted carefully. So overall, what we saw with the survey was a bit of a negative shift in sentiment. Revenue and profit declines were affecting more firms than in recent surveys. Smaller businesses especially were more impacted than larger businesses this time around. We also saw that hiring pulled back more, and those that were hiring weren't as interested in taking on new full-time staff members. Many weren't planning to reduce staffing levels, though, and among those that are still hiring, many were having more issues with finding skilled workers than just any workers. We also saw wage pressures continuing to ease. Many business owners had experienced increases in both wholesale and retail costs, which was a major challenge after already struggling with high prices over the past few years. And changes to government policies also emerged as a top issue for businesses this time around. Overall, despite a few improvements on the labor side, more businesses reported a negative outlook for the next 6 months than those that were positive, which we'll get into that a little bit more later. And with that, I'm going to let Ron take it away to talk about revenue and profits.
Thank you, Haley, and good morning to everyone. And thanks to everyone for showing up today. Again, a little shout out to any of the business partners that happen to be watching, any businesses that happen to have responded that are watching. We really appreciate everyone's involvement and helping just trying to better understand the current economic environment. So let's talk a little bit about some specifics about the survey itself, recent revenue and profit trends. So a couple of quick pointers before I get started on some of the actual data, just a few chart pointers. So the color scheme here, we've changed it from red, green to orange, blue to be a little bit more color sensitive. So orange essentially means decline, blue means growth. And we do a lot of time series. We want to compare this survey to previous July surveys usually. And we're always going to put the most recent survey at the bottom so you can kind of see that cascade in terms of how things are changing. In terms of this particular question, recent quarter revenue compared with the same quarter last year, what we see is that generally speaking, what we're comparing is red minus blue, or blue minus red, however you want to look at it. And generally speaking, what we're seeing is a negative overall trend. So in other words, more firms are reporting that they are seeing revenue decline year over year for that quarter compared to those that saw growth. So clearly not necessarily a great trend. Now, what you will notice is that it's very comparable to what it was last year at this time. I don't really know exactly how to interpret that. One can say, I think that maybe conditions really haven't changed that much. There was an awful lot of uncertainty last year as it related to the presidential election. We heard a lot about that. I don't know that circumstances haven't necessarily changed, but businesses are reporting generally the same proportion that are not seeing a great revenue trend. In terms of the recent quarterly profit trend, also quite negative. So profits have really struggled since the onset of higher inflation in 22-23, and we haven't really seen much improvement in that area. And I would say just a very, very slight improvement over last year, but I would call that probably within the margin of error for sure. So generally the same trend as we saw last year. The source of the struggle, I think everyone listening knows there's an awful lot of challenges in today's economy. The list is pretty long. We're going to talk a little bit more about the challenges in a little bit. So in terms of what they're expecting going forward, again, it's important to know what they've done recently. It's also important to know what they think is going to happen going forward. Expectations, unfortunately, remain pretty negative by a sizable margin. Again, the share of businesses that think they're going to see revenue growth for the coming quarter, year over year, compared to those that are expecting growth versus decline, again, on the negative side, unfortunately. Technically, there's a small revenue improvement, so there's a slightly smaller share that are predicting decline, but I wouldn't, it's still net negative. And I think that's important to note that overall it's net negative. It's a small improvement for what we're seeing right now, and hopefully it'll improve even more than what they're expecting. A few other views. So we ask firms to tell us a little bit about themselves so we can see if there are certain firm traits that we might be able to point to as having some importance to point out. So one of the things, probably the one that stands out the most, is to look at results by firm size. And the thing that's interesting this time is that if you go back to the January survey, and that's the little chart in the corner, what we were seeing is that size really didn't matter. Early in the pandemic, size really mattered. So we were seeing much better performance by large firms, kind of given the challenge of the pandemic and the early recovery inflation. I think large firms were seeing some advantage to size. And I think what we saw with this survey is that we're seeing some return to that. So that tiered performance seems to be coming back a little bit more than it was previously. The expectations for the third quarter fell among larger companies, but they are still better than what smaller firms are projecting for the coming quarter as well. Same thing for the profits, but I would say a little bit more compressed. So we don't see quite the same difference in performance. If you look at large companies, their profit margins, the share saying profits rose versus profits decline, roughly the same. So we didn't see quite the same difference in scale by firm size, but it's still present. We also ask them to report their sector and what state they're in. And I would say first thing I want to mention is, as Haley mentioned, this is a convenient sample, and we don't always get large responses, particularly by sector, sometimes even by state. So I would say these small samples, really, I would ask you to take all of this kind of with a grain of salt and interpret cautiously. What we did see in the data as far as sector is concerned is finance, insurance, and real estate, or the fire sector, and transportation and warehouse were the only sectors that saw net positive revenue performance. All of the others were either kind of even or net negative. And those that were the most negative were wholesale and retail trade, education, childcare, healthcare, and manufacturing. Those were the ones that had a large proportion of respondents say they were seeing a negative revenue trend. Among states, only Montana saw a net positive response in the second quarter revenues, excuse me. The one thing I want to point out, and it's a way of kind of saying the state results, I think probably don't really flush out very well. Montana had a disproportionately large fire response, those businesses in the finance, insurance, and real estate sector. It also saw, if you just kind of triangulate, Montana actually had a fairly negative quarter one GDP number as well. So I don't think there's really much evidence that I can see that Montana is performing very differently than the rest of the states in the 9th district. And with that, we're going to go to workforce and wage trends, and I'm going to hand it back to Haley.
Thanks, Ron. So yeah, now let's see what respondents told us about hiring and other labor trends in July. We can definitely see that hiring has continued to pull back a lot this year. If you look at this chart, we're comparing the last two July surveys in blue and green to this year's results in orange. And we see that compared to 2023 and 2024, a much higher share is no longer hiring. And you can also see that there's been a pretty big dip in the shares that were hiring to replace turnover and hiring for seasonal workers as well. Somewhat good news, though, is that it appears that most businesses aren't reducing their overall staffing levels that much. That share, as you can see over on the right, has ticked up slightly over the past few years, but remains small. This is kind of reflective of that overall low hire but low fire job market that's been talked about a lot at the national level this year. We also see that many businesses expect their staffing to be flat in the near future. While there hasn't been too much change in this over the past few years, the share of firms expecting growth has shrunk slightly compared to the share expecting declines. There also may be some seasonality informing these results. In our January surveys, we're usually seeing more firms expecting growth compared with our July surveys. A lot of this just probably has to do because of the timing of the surveys. Many businesses responding right now have already hired for their summer business needs and just won't need the staff come fall and winter. Now, as hiring slows down, we are seeing that those that are still hiring are seeing more of an issue with the lack of skilled applicants instead of not receiving enough applications at all. This improvement, well, you can kind of think of it as an improvement, was reflected in some comments from businesses who found that hiring low-level and entry-level employees was easier now than it has been in the past, but finding more experienced and skilled workers was still pretty difficult. So it kind of seems like there are a lot more people, maybe looking for jobs now than say back in 2023, but they just might not be what the hiring employers are looking for. We also heard that applicant wage demands were still an issue, with a lot of business owners commenting that it was just too difficult to afford to meet those demands right now. And speaking of wages, it's clear that wage growth has continued to slow over the past year. Most businesses are still increasing wages, but there is a growing share that have kept their wages flat or have even decreased them. And now, if we look to firm size, we see that larger businesses still tend to be giving larger wage increases to their employers than smaller businesses. Nearly 40% of businesses with 10 or fewer employees were not increasing their wages at this time. In the comments, we heard from a lot of smaller businesses who felt like they were losing their employees to larger businesses and big chains due to their higher wage offerings. And as we saw earlier with firm size, these smaller businesses are just kind of having a harder time bringing in revenue right now compared to larger businesses, which kind of makes affording labor costs more difficult. Now, given all of this, we're always very interested in seeing what specific challenges businesses are facing. So if you look at this chart, you can see on the left here that price increases and high interest rates have been big challenges for the past few years, and we're still ranking pretty high. And the labor availability, as you can see a little further to the right, used to be a top issue, but this has declined significantly. What probably caught most of your eyes, though, when I switched to this chart was the jump in government policies as an issue. In fact, it was the top issue for respondents in this survey. We know that there have been a lot of changes to government policies this year at both the federal and state level for some. This is a broad category, so it can be kind of hard to suss out what exactly these respondents are referring to when selecting this option. So, we looked to the comment box under this question to see what respondents were saying, and there were quite a few comments about changes to trade policies this year, with most of the comments leading negative. There were also some about federal spending cuts, either directly affecting businesses or affecting their clients. On the state level, we saw some comments, especially in Minnesota, about recent paid leave legislation, taxes, minimum wage policies, but just not to the same extent as the number of comments about trade. Now, back in January, similarly, we received comments in that survey from people concerned or excited about changes to trade policies this year. So we decided to add a special question this time around to really, focus in on that. And as you can see in the chart, a little over half of businesses reported that tariffs had had a negative impact this year. About 30% really didn't see any effect at all. Among those that had been negatively impacted, the comments revealed that some effects were direct while others were more indirect for businesses. So more indirectly, some said that customer demand was wavering due to uncertainty caused by tariffs. For example, we had a couple comments about demand from Canadian customers being affected. Others just found that planning for the future was really difficult when they just weren't sure what policy was going to stick. Now, some that were more directly affected had commented that they were experiencing price increases on materials that they import, which were really eating into their profits. Some also experienced this with US manufacturers who were raising their prices to match the increases of imported goods. So while government policies were a top challenge this round, high prices, as I mentioned earlier, were the second most pressing issue for businesses. In this chart here, we can see that respondents to the survey have reported improving price pressures up until this survey. So on the wholesale side here, which you can see, there's been a pretty significant jump with over about 60% of businesses reporting price increases of 5% or more since last year. Now, on the retail side, there's a similar uptick, but just not to the same extent as wholesale. Some businesses commented that they've been really reluctant to pass along their wholesale price increases to their customers since they were already seeing a lot of price sensitivity among them. Many said that they were having to eat these increases as to not drive more customers away at the moment. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Ron to talk about Outlook.
Thank you, Haley. So in terms of outlook, what we've seen is I would say somewhat similar to what we saw in prices in that we saw a change in sentiment overall. So if here's where I'm including the last five, all the January, July, going back to July 2023. So we get a little bit better sense if there's any seasonality to this. And what we're seeing is basically that the outlook was kind of getting increasingly more positive, particularly in January, and that we've seen a little bit of a pivot in that outlook overall, where we went from a net positive response overall to a net negative one. Not dramatically net negative, but it is net negative. If you happen to look over at the outlook by firm size, there is, I think, not surprisingly, given that we've seen stronger performance by firm size, larger firms doing a little bit better, probably not surprising that we're also seeing a little bit more optimism among larger firms. It's neither good nor bad. What I would say is how to think about that is the good part is the large firms are more responsible for a larger share of employment and overall GDP, but small firms are obviously the larger share of all firms. So it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It is a thing. It's good depending on where you maybe lie in that firm size structure. So overall, net negative. Hopefully with some changes hopefully that we might see in the economy going forward, that we'll see that improve, but that's where we are right now. So some final thoughts. Overall, I think it's pretty clear that conditions are softening among Ninth District businesses. The revenue and profit trends remain negative for many. Hopefully that will rebound. Smaller firms, again, appear to be having a little bit more difficulty in this current environment. Labor demand is pulled back. We've seen that kind of consistently soften. The good news for employers, bad news for workers, is that wage pressures are continuing to ease. They're still positive, but continuing to ease. Government policies right now are really the top concern, where it was prices and labor previously. Now we really have seen a very large uptick in the biggest challenge being kind of current government policy led by tariffs. And I think also notably that respondents report that prices have pivoted higher. That actually is reflected a little bit in this morning's CPI release. Not exactly, but maybe not to the same degree. But we are seeing some evidence of additional inflation as far as the release from the CPI number, and it kind of is reflected in what businesses are telling us as well. Outlook net negative. And overall, I think I would just say there's just lots of uncertainty. It's what we heard very consistently in the comment section. So for businesses out there, I think what they're hoping is for a little bit more certainty going forward. So we're going to take some questions here. We got probably a good 10 minutes to potentially take some questions. If you have any, please put them in the chat box for us to have. But before we go there, what I really want to do is just give you one small bit of insight on our survey work. So these surveys are really, really important to us, but we only do this particular survey twice a year. We're trying to build this business pulse survey that we have right now into something that's much more robust in the sense of giving us monthly insights on how businesses are doing, especially when things are uncertain. That's when the Federal Reserve System and the Minneapolis Fed are really, really looking for more insights from businesses. Because of the nature of data right now, it's either time lagged or maybe our trust in some data. It's really important for the Fed to get as many business insights as we can get. So there's a QR code on your screen here. We would love to get any business owner or executive or manager that has good insight into how their business is performing, so you can be part of that insight group that we collect on a monthly basis, share with President Kashkari, who I think really uses an awful lot of information, but I think increasingly is interested in knowing what's happening on the ground with businesses. We're really interested in getting your insights on kind of data questions, but also your comments so we can get a better feel for conditions on the ground. So anyone watching today that's willing to be part of our survey panel, we would greatly appreciate it. Okay, and with that, I'm going to leave that QR code up and I'll take some questions.
Yeah, so just as a reminder, if you do have a question, please type it in the chat box on Zoom. So we've had a couple come in so far. Someone was wondering, do you see any state by state differences or those near the Canadian border?
I don't know that we see a lot of state by state differences. I'll just reference the Q1. Um, for Q1, it's hard to to put too much emphasis on any single quarter. The Western states were a little bit more negative in Q1, but if you go roll back a year earlier, they were also more positive in Q1 in 2024. What I would say we are seeing more is some regional differences, particularly as it relates to the Canadian border. It's hard to put a finger on. What we do know for a fact is that land passenger crossings are down almost 20% through June. We do hear from a lot of tourism businesses that have noted that they are seeing many fewer Canadian travelers. Recently saw something that the St. Paul International Airport is expecting roughly about a 13% decline in Canadian travelers this year. That's from Explore, Minnesota. And so I think there is some evidence very clearly that we're seeing different traffic patterns from Canadians. And if you service that market, especially from a traveler standpoint, you're going to see some impact.
Thanks, Ron. Someone else was wondering, how are businesses navigating the AI movement and how are they adjusting to the new environment regarding mergers?
That's an excellent question. One I don't have really specific insights on. I don't think there's any question right now. AI is kind of increasingly involved in all of our workplaces. I think there's a lot of nervousness around what impact it might have on labor. I think businesses understandably are very excited about the possibility of an improving productivity. We don't have very good measures on its impact. We are starting to hear about maybe some layoffs related to the fact that more kinds of jobs can be automated by AI. What we don't have is a great way to track exactly what those impacts have been. I don't think there's any question. I hope, or I kind of assume that our data collectors are working on exactly that. And I think that's going to be an important measure to follow going forward.
Yeah, and I could also just add that when I was looking through the results of this survey, people leave a bunch of comments on all sorts of topics, and AI didn't come up that frequently. There were a few mentions of it, mainly from professional services businesses who were, kind of impacted because they were providing marketing services that were now being taken over by AI. But again, these were just a few comments here and there about it. It wasn't, it didn't seem to be a top issue for a lot of
Yeah,
these businesses in this particular survey.
great. Thanks for sharing that, Haley.
Yeah, for sure. So then someone else was wondering, how confident are you about the impact of trade and tariffs when there are so many negative responses, even though most of the tariffs haven't taken effect?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The one thing to point out first is, tariffs are a really big focus, or it's really kind of on the public's mind and on businesses' mind. It is less a part of the U.S. economy than maybe people appreciate. I believe it's somewhere in the 13 to 14% range, import export, in terms of share of GDP. And so it isn't actually impacting everybody. It may impact everybody in some kind of ripple sense, so that from that sense, I think everyone's paying attention to it. In terms of its actual impact, I think what we're seeing is that the effects are kind of slower rolling than maybe many projected them to be. We had a big surge of imports to beat some of the tariffs, some of the tariff policies going in, some of them continuing to change. I think what we're likely to see is, whatever net impact is likely. I think as we head more and more into the holiday season and retail stores and other places really start re-ramping up on inventory, I think we're likely to see just how much tariffs are going to have an impact. What I would say about tariffs, though, I think that maybe that I don't want to call it hidden. It's not hidden to the business community, is the uncertainty that has been introduced to business planning. We hear a lot about uncertainty, and we hear about a lot of uncertainty related to tariffs. And I think the uncertainty creates caution, and where caution is, businesses are going to pull back where they're not confident of making a wise investment. So I actually think many businesses are in pretty good shape. but they are maybe not making the investments, maybe not making the hiring that they otherwise would if that uncertainty weren't there.
Hmm.
If that uncertainty wasn't there. Sorry, bad grammar.
Yeah. And yes, still on this tariff topic here, someone's wondering which types of businesses were most directly affected by price increases from tariffs.
Well, what we're seeing in the data, and I would like to have a better chance to take a look at some of the new CPI numbers in terms of product areas. But what we had been seeing is, the things that we import a lot of, especially consumer goods and large consumer goods, durable goods, is where we are seeing the most impact of price increases. And I think it's not a stretch to tie much of that to tariffs. And so I think generally that's what we're seeing. Inflation for some services, non-durable goods is actually much flatter too. So if
Mhm.
you are in that durable goods, especially big ticket durable goods, that's probably where you're seeing most price pressure.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then this is kind of in the same vein of the uncertainty conversation. Someone wanted you to comment on consumer confidence based on the survey and today's uncertainty, specifically in travel and tourism.
Well, I think consumers act like businesses do, where, people might be fearful of their job, or maybe where they've seen strong wage increases in the past, maybe they're expecting something less. What do consumers do? They do what businesses do. They're maybe going to pull in, and we are seeing some. I've only heard anecdotes. It's hard to track like consumer spending as it relates to say travel, tourism, things like that on a really specific level. We are hearing of a little bit more maybe staycations, maybe a little less travel to outside the U.S. Um, and consumer sentiment surveys were really quite negative a few months ago. They've rebounded from lower levels up to somewhat higher levels, but still below what it would have been a few years ago. So I think we're seeing consumers express kind of the same levels of uncertainty that businesses have. And again, uncertainty generally is not great for the economy, whether consumer or for business.
Great. Thanks, Ron. And looks like we don't have any other questions coming into the chat. So that's going to be our last question for today. Thank you all so much for joining us. And more information will be in our follow-up email to this event. And with that, I really hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everyone.